Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. It all started with a glance, one fleeting moment that sent a chill down my spine. We were at our favorite restaurant, sharing the usual Friday night dinner. The same place we'd gone for years. Our ritual, one I'd always found comfort in. Ashley sat across from me, hair falling effortlessly over her shoulders, smiling that bright smile of hers. She reached for her wine glass, fingers delicate as always, when her phone buzzed. Nothing unusual, except this time she didn't glance up at me with that apologetic look she usually gave before checking a message. Instead, she tilted the screen away, eyes flitting quickly over whatever was written. I watched her lips curve into a smile, soft, secretive, before she snapped back to the present, smile vanishing like it had never been there at all. "It's just work," she muttered before I even asked, tucking the phone away. I nodded, forcing a smile, but something about the moment wouldn't let go of me. Maybe it was the way she turned her attention back to me, too quickly, too neatly, or the way her voice wavered just a bit. Whatever it was, I shrugged it off. A passing thought, nothing more. But once the thought was there, it began to gnaw at me. It was nothing, I told myself repeatedly over the next few days. Don't be paranoid. She'd always been devoted, consistent, the kind of woman you could build a life with. But then there were more small things, imperceptible shifts that most people wouldn't notice. I started seeing changes in the way she acted, tiny, almost unnoticeable differences that one by one began to pile up. She started taking phone calls outside, claiming it was for better reception. When we watched TV together, she'd sit with her phone held tight, replying to messages rapidly, sometimes laughing at the screen, an easy, carefree laugh I hadn't heard in a while. If I asked what it was about, she'd say it was a funny meme from a friend, and I'd nod, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. There were other things too. Ashley's late-night work meetings became more frequent, her excuses getting flimsier. She'd come home smelling like expensive perfume, the kind she'd never bothered with before. A gift from a colleague, she said, but I noticed the smile that would linger on her lips when she thought I wasn't looking. A smile that had nothing to do with me or anything happening in our life. And it wasn't just her behavior that changed. The people around us, the ones who used to laugh with us, who would look at us with envy for the solid marriage we had, started acting differently. It was subtle but unmistakable. Friends became more distant, conversations grew stilted. The casual remarks about our marriage, how lucky I was, how perfect we were together, stopped altogether. There was something in the way they glanced at Ashley when they thought I wasn't looking, a flicker of unease or maybe pity. I couldn't tell which. The doubt grew, festering like a wound. The more I thought about it, the more I noticed. Little things, a new wardrobe full of designer clothes, expensive jewelry I hadn't bought. Her style had always been understated, casual, yet suddenly she was dressing up even for a quick trip to the grocery store. I'd make a passing comment, only for her to shrug it off with a light laugh, telling me I was being silly. But her eyes would narrow, guarded, as if daring me to push further. Each dismissal left me feeling like I was the one in the wrong. Maybe I was being unreasonable. But then Ashley started getting defensive, snapping at questions I thought were harmless. "Why do you care what I wear?" she'd say, or "Can't I just treat myself for once without it being a big deal?" One night I found myself staring at our joint bank account, something I hadn't thought to check in months. Something I hadn't. We'd always been transparent about finances, both contributing to the pot without question. But as I scrolled through the transactions, I saw a few unfamiliar charges. Boutique stores, upscale restaurants, lavish amounts spent at places I'd never even heard of. My heart hammered, a dull, pulsing ache that spread through my chest. When I brought it up, she laughed it off, saying she'd been catching up with friends and needed some new clothes. The lie was casual, too smooth, but I didn't say anything. What could I say? That's how it went for weeks. Every question felt like walking on eggshells. Every time she laughed off my concerns or snapped back with indignant denial, a piece of me chipped away. There was always something, a missed dinner here, a canceled trip there, a last-minute emergency at work. I'd ask if we were still good, still us, and she'd look at me like I was crazy. "We're fine," she'd say, a touch too quickly. Why wouldn't we be? One night she didn't come home at all. I stayed up, eyes fixed on the clock. 1 hour, 2 hours. By the time the first light of dawn crept in through the blinds, I'd memorized every shadow that flickered against our living room walls. She walked in with a hollow apology and the stench of alcohol lingering on her clothes, claiming she'd stayed at a friend's after a work party ran late. "Didn't want to drive home drunk," she muttered. I stared at her, disbelief mingling with the bitter taste of betrayal. "Who was it?" I asked, voice tight. "What are you talking about?" She rolled her eyes, slipping past me. "Brian, stop being paranoid." "It's exhausting." Her words were a slap in the face. Exhausting? I was exhausting? A burning sensation rose in my chest. Anger coiled so tightly that I thought I'd snap, but I swallowed it down, forced my voice to steady. "I'm just asking. Because you don't seem like yourself lately." Ashley's gaze turned cold, a chill settling between us. "Maybe it's because you're suffocating me with your constant accusations." She stormed off, leaving me standing there in the empty living room, our argument echoing in the silence. I glanced at our wedding photo on the mantel, Ashley's smile radiant, my own expression full of hope. I couldn't remember the last time she looked at me like that. Couldn't remember the last time I felt like that guy in the picture. I reached for the frame, running a finger along the glass. Had I been blind all this time? Had I been so wrapped up in our routine, so sure of what we had, that I'd missed the signs? That night, as I stood alone, doubts gnawed at me like rats in the dark. Was I imagining things, letting paranoia twist me up inside? Or had I already lost her to someone else? The thoughts circled endlessly, pulling me deeper into a vortex of fear and uncertainty. By the time the sun fully rose, I hadn't slept a wink. I turned to look at Ashley, still fast asleep in our bed, looking as innocent and peaceful as ever. But I knew something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a certainty, sharp and biting. I didn't know what the truth was yet, but I could feel it looming, dark and oppressive, just out of reach. And I knew one thing for sure. I was going to find it, no matter what it took. I knew I wouldn't find any peace until I unearthed the truth. I tried to hold on, to give her the benefit of the doubt, but that night, watching her sleep beside me, was the breaking point. I was done guessing, done questioning myself. Whatever it took, I would get my answers. And so, my descent into obsession began. The next morning, I called in sick at work, something I'd never done before, so I spent hours combing through every piece of technology Ashley had access to. I started with the basics. Her phone. Of course, she kept it locked, and I didn't know the passcode. But her laptop, or Bari top, her sleek silver MacBook that she treated like an extension of herself, that was in the living room, left open on the coffee table. She'd always been careless with it. I took a deep breath and sat down, fingers hovering over the keys. My palms were slick with sweat as I pulled up her emails. There was nothing there, just boring office updates and promotional spam. But something felt off. A person hiding a secret would never leave it in plain sight. I glanced at the folder list on the left side of the screen and noticed one labeled Archives. My heart pounded as I clicked it. The folder was full of emails that didn't fit the mundane patterns of work. They were brief, impersonal, yet there was a familiarity in the language. References to shared dinners, discussions of meeting times. One particular email chain stood out, a series of terse one-line messages sent late at night. "Last night was amazing. Let's do it again." Same place? I scrolled further, jaw tightening as I read, "Brian won't suspect a thing." I shut the laptop, bile rising in my throat. That confirmation hit harder than I'd expected, knocking the breath out of me. But I didn't stop. Instead, I felt a cold, focused energy surge through me. Anger, raw and pulsing, narrowed my vision. This was only the beginning. I wasn't going to confront her with vague accusations or let her twist the narrative. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof. The next few days passed in a blur. I barely slept, haunted by fragments of those messages. Each morning, I'd wait until she left for work, then dive back into my investigation. I called the phone company and requested our detailed billing records. A short argument about verification later, I had access to months of call logs and text histories. Most of the numbers were familiar: friends, colleagues, family. But there was one number that stood out. It appeared almost daily, multiple times. Short calls, sometimes just minutes apart. I dialed it, hard hammering, and my worst fears were confirmed when a man's voice answered on the other end. I didn't speak, just listened as he repeated, "Hello? Who is this?" I hung up, the sound of his voice lingering in my ear like a curse. I searched that number online, trying to find out who he was. My fingers flew over the keys as I scoured every database, social media site, and search engine. Hours later, I stumbled upon it, a LinkedIn profile. Jacob Russell, wealth manager, the kind of man who wouldn't think twice about dropping a few $1,000s on dinner or whisking someone away for a spontaneous weekend. The type of man Ashley had apparently decided I wasn't. Seeing his photo, clean-cut, square jaw, that self-assured smirk, fueled something dark inside me. This was the man she was sneaking off to meet. This was the one who had been dining on my humiliation while I lay awake at night, wondering where I'd gone wrong. My mind spiraled as I imagined every scenario, every lie she'd told. The thought of them together, laughing at my expense, made my skin burn. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I knew she'd deny it all, twist it around like she always did, make me out to be the villain. No, I needed something that would leave no room for doubt. So I started following her. It felt surreal. Me, sitting in my car, keeping a safe distance as she left work one evening. My hands clenched the steering wheel tight enough to hurt, knuckles white under the dim glow of the dashboard. She pulled out of the parking lot, taking a right onto the main road. I trailed behind, keeping enough space between us that she wouldn't notice. But she wasn't going home, not even close. She drove to the other side of town, stopping in front of a high-end hotel. I watched from a side street as she stepped out of her car, looking around furtively before hurrying inside. The hotel's gaudy sign flickered against the night sky, casting a sickly yellow light over her figure. I felt my heart sink as a man appeared at the entrance. Jacob. He took her hand, and they disappeared inside together. Everything inside me crumbled. There was no mistaking what was happening. Still, I forced myself to stay. I needed to see it through. My mind screamed at me to leave, but I stayed, watching for over an hour until they finally emerged. They looked disheveled, satisfied. I bit back the bile rising in my throat as I snapped a few photos with my phone. Proof, unquestionable proof. The drive back home was a blur. By the time I parked the car, I felt hollowed out, like a husk. Yet beneath that emptiness, a new resolve had taken root. I didn't sleep that night, nor the next. I just sat there, staring at those images. Her hand in his, her smile, that look of pure contentment on her face, one I hadn't seen directed at me in years. She was mine, and yet she wasn't. The reality of that truth twisted inside me, turning what should have been sorrow into something colder, sharper. The next morning, I finally confronted her. She was at the kitchen table sipping coffee, scrolling through her phone with that practiced, innocent expression. "We need to talk," I said, voice tight. She looked up, brow furrowed. "What's wrong now?" A note of impatience, like I was a child throwing another tantrum. I took a deep breath, sliding my phone across the table. The screen lit up, displaying the photos I'd taken. Her smile faded, eyes widening as she looked at them. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, panic flaring in her gaze. "Does it matter?" I leaned forward, voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Tell me the truth, Ashley." "How long?" She stared at me, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I can explain. Explain. I let out a hollow laugh. Explain how you've been screwing some guy behind my back? Explain why you thought I'd be too stupid to notice? You're being unreasonable. Her voice rose, eyes blazing with sudden defiance. You don't know what it's been like, being married to you. You're always working, always distracted, and I just... Stop. My voice sliced through her excuses. Don't you dare blame this on me. You could have come to me, said something, anything, but instead, you chose this. I gestured to the photos. You chose to lie. Her face crumpled, tears welling up. Brian, I'm sorry. I... Save it. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, disgust tightening my chest. I don't want your apologies. You think I didn't notice how you've been spending our money? How you've been using me to keep up appearances while you run off with him? Brian, please, No. I stood up, heart pounding in my ears. I'm done. You want him? Fine. You can have him. But don't think for a second that I'm going to sit back and let you walk away unscathed. Her expression turned wary, confusion mingling with fear. What do you mean? I leaned in close, dropping my voice to a low, venomous whisper. I mean, you're about to find out exactly what happens when you betray me, Ashley. And trust me, you're not going to like it. I watched as the realization dawned in her eyes, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. Good. Let her fear. Let her wonder what I'd do next. Because from this moment on, I wasn't just her husband. I was her worst nightmare. After that confrontation, something in me snapped into place. The anger didn't dissipate. It sharpened, like a blade honed on a whetstone. Clarity emerged from the storm of emotions, replacing the chaotic hurt with a cold resolve. There was no yelling, no accusations flying back and forth, just the quiet, measured acceptance of what I had to do next. I left the house without another word to Ashley, letting her stew in the fear of what might come. That look on her face, the panic and disbelief, was like fuel. As I walked away, a dark thrill coiled around my spine. I wasn't about to let her go unscathed. She'd get what she deserved, piece by piece. I drove straight to the bank. I'd planned to empty our joint account for a while, but now it was time to execute. I sat across from the bank manager, a picture of calm, and gave a convincing story about needing to separate our finances due to upcoming changes in our lives. He didn't question it. With a few signatures and a swipe of my ID, every penny Ashley had access to was transferred into my personal account. My lips curled as I watched the numbers update on the screen in front of me. The account that had been the foundation of our shared life now read zero. Ashley had no idea what was coming. She'd grown comfortable, thinking she could run around with her rich lover and I'd be none the wiser, or worse, too weak to fight back. But the satisfaction I felt as I walked out of the bank told me otherwise. This was only the beginning. But even as I relished the small victory, I knew I couldn't rest. There were more things to handle, loose ends to tie up, safeguards to put in place. By the time I got home that evening, Ashley hadn't moved from the kitchen. She was still sitting there, her face a mask of confusion and exhaustion. Brian, please. She started, but I silenced her with a raised hand. Don't, I warned quietly. Just don't. She looked like she might break down, but I turned away, leaving her there. The silence between us was thick, oppressive. I knew she was waiting for some reaction, screaming, crying, anything that would show her I was still that man she could manipulate. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. Let her keep wondering, let the uncertainty gnaw at her. Once upstairs, I pulled out my phone and contacted my lawyer. The conversation was brief, but he confirmed my worst suspicion. Ashley had preemptively filed for divorce. I felt a pang of something. Was it disappointment? Resentment? But I swallowed it down. The revelation wasn't surprising, not after everything else I'd learned. She wanted a clean break, probably expected to take me for half of everything I owned. Typical, but I wasn't going to make it that easy. I got to work immediately, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Over the next few days, I compiled a file so damning it felt like I was preparing for a murder trial. The text logs, the photos, the bank records showing unexplained withdrawals. All of it painted a picture of Ashley's betrayal in stark, unforgiving detail. But it wasn't just about legal leverage. I started reviewing her spending habits, tracing where our money had gone. I found all the usual, clothes, dinners, trips, but there were other things too. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments that couldn't be easily explained. Each discovery added another layer to my resolve. Once I had everything in order, I made an appointment with my lawyer. Sitting in his office, I felt more alive than I had in weeks. He looked over the documents, his expression tightening as he read. When he finally looked up, there was a glint of respect in his eyes. "You've built a solid case here, Brian. If she thinks she's getting anything out of this, she's in for a rude awakening." "I want her left with nothing," I said evenly. "No money, no house, nothing. I'll make sure of it." He nodded, already taking notes. "We'll contest every claim. You've more than enough to prove misconduct, which means the court will likely favor you. But there's one thing, she could still try to go after other assets, especially if she brings her new boyfriend into this. His financial influence could complicate things." "Let her try," I murmured. "I'm ready for whatever she throws at me." The legal wheels were in motion, but I knew it wasn't enough. I needed to strike somewhere it really hurt, somewhere beyond just finances. That's when I remembered her job. Ashley worked at a marketing firm, a place she'd clawed her way into after years of hard work. But she hadn't gotten there on talent alone. Jacob had helped her secure the position, using his connections to ensure she skipped the usual red tape. It would be so easy to pull that rug out from under her. I made a few calls, carefully worded inquiries to some old contacts. I'd helped a few people out over the years, and now it was time to cash in those favors. A strategic tip-off here, a suggestion there, and suddenly whispers about her questionable professional conduct started circulating within her firm. I knew her office wasn't immune to scandals. It wouldn't take much for them to question whether keeping her on was worth the potential fallout. The day she lost her job, I pretended not to notice the way she sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I didn't ask how her day was or if something happened. I let her come to me, let her squirm under the weight of it all until she finally snapped. "Brian," she called out softly one evening, voice brittle. I lost my job." I didn't respond right away, giving her words time to hang in the air, to echo around the room and settle into her bones. Then I turned to her, expression blank. "Is that so?" She nodded, eyes wide and desperate. They said there were some concerns, rumors about personal issues affecting my work." She was practically choking on the words. "I don't know how it happened, but they said they had to let me go." "Sounds rough," I replied, voice devoid of sympathy. "Brian, you don't understand. I need that job. Why don't you ask Jacob to help you out?" I cut her off, watching the shock ripple across her face. "Oh, wait, didn't he get you that position in the first place?" "I'm sure he'd be more than happy to pull a few strings again." Her face flushed a deep crimson, but she didn't argue. She just stared at me, something breaking behind her eyes. The days that followed were a blur of quiet satisfaction. Everything I did was designed to make her feel smaller, more helpless. When she tried to access our joint account, she discovered the funds were gone. Every call she made to her bank, every tearful plea to reverse the transactions, ended with the same answer: "There's nothing we can do." I watched her panic grow as she realized how much she relied on that money. She came to me, frantic, begging for help, but I shrugged her off. "Figure it out yourself, Ashley. It's your mess to clean up now." When she called her lover, I listened from the next room. Heard her voice crack as she pleaded with him for support, only to be met with cold indifference. "I can't deal with this right now, Ashley," he said, voice distant. "You're on your own." That was when the first real crack appeared in her facade. I could hear it in the way she sobbed into the phone after he hung up, the frantic gasps for air as she realized how alone she really was. She was losing everything. Slowly, systematically, I was dismantling the life she'd tried to build on the ashes of ours. But then, Just when I thought I had her cornered, everything shifted. My lawyer called, voice serious. Brian, we have a problem. Ashley's filing for a larger settlement. She's claiming infidelity on your part. Apparently, she's saying you've been hiding assets. I froze, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. What the hell was this? She was trying to flip the narrative, make me out to be the guilty one. It was a bold move, one that took me completely by surprise. But as the initial shock wore off, a cold smile crept across my face. So she still thought she could play the game, still thought she could win. Let her try, I told my lawyer, voice steady. I've got enough on her to bury her in court. But this wasn't just about the legal battle anymore. It was about something far deeper. I'd made her life a living hell, and she was trying to claw her way out. But I'd be damned if I let her come out on top. She thought she could take everything. No, I'd make sure she left with less than nothing. By the time I hung up, my mind was racing. I had to refine my plan, take it further, push her to the brink. If she wanted a war, I'd give her one she'd never forget. From the moment I hung up the phone with my lawyer, I knew I had to escalate things. The satisfaction of watching her struggle, scrambling to regain control only to have everything slip further away, had become addictive. But now, with her trying to twist the narrative in court, she'd raised the stakes. Fine, I'd show her what a real fight looked like. I spent the next week making calls. If Ashley wanted to involve Jacob in this mess, I'd make sure their entire foundation crumbled beneath them. It was time to pull every string, cash in every favor. I wanted to burn everything she thought she had left. The first target was her social circle. With a few strategic whispers, I planted seeds of doubt among her so-called friends. It wasn't hard. People like them thrived on gossip, always eager to witness a fall from grace. By the time I was done, the rumors had spread like wildfire. Ashley wasn't just having an affair. She was using Jacob for his money, had cheated on me with other men, and was blackmailing her way into jobs. Truth mixed with fiction, blurring the lines enough that no one could tell where one started and the other ended. I didn't have to do much after that. Their own curiosity and vindictiveness took care of the rest. I saw it happen gradually, like a slow-motion train wreck. Invitations to brunches and parties dried up. Her phone, which once buzzed incessantly, fell silent. The few times I caught her looking at it, she'd just stare at the screen, brow furrowed, fingers hovering as if she couldn't bring herself to reach out and ask why. The next move was to dismantle her relationship with Jacob. It didn't take much to find his business dealings. He was a public figure, after all, and his wealth was built on connections and reputation. All it took was one anonymous tip to a regulatory agency about potential insider trading and unethical practices, and the house of cards started shaking. I knew his type, obsessive about control and appearances. He wouldn't risk his empire for some woman, not when he could easily cut his losses and move on. Ashley noticed the change immediately. Jacob started distancing himself, calls cut short, meetings postponed. One night I watched from the corner of the room as she dialed his number repeatedly, only for the line to go straight to voicemail. Her face contorted with anger, frustration, and finally desperation. I could almost feel the weight of her fear as she realized she was losing him too. Then came the final push. I made sure to have someone approach him directly. Another whisper, this time suggesting that she was about to drag his name into her divorce proceedings, claim he was complicit in her deceit, that he was her co-conspirator in siphoning off my assets. True or not, the mere suggestion would be enough to send him running. The news broke late one evening. I'd been in my office, methodically documenting each of these actions in a file I'd labeled The Fall. Ashley stumbled in, her face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. I glanced up, feigning indifference as she stood there, trembling. He left me, she whispered, voice cracking. Jacob, he's gone. He said, I'm too much trouble, that I'm toxic. I forced my expression to remain neutral, though satisfaction coiled warmly in my chest. Toxic. The word suited her perfectly. Maybe he finally saw you for who you really are, I said coldly, watching her flinch as if struck. She stared at me, eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and something else, something close to terror. It was a look I'd never seen on her before, and I relished it. "What did you do?" she breathed, voice almost inaudible. "Me?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I did nothing, Ashley. This is all you. You burned your own life down. I'm just watching it happen." She collapsed onto the floor, head in her hands, sobs shaking her frame. I watched for a moment, almost detached, as if observing a stranger's pain. But I felt nothing. No sympathy, no pity, just a calm, steady resolve. She'd done this to herself. The next few days were a whirlwind. Ashley tried to reach out to her few remaining contacts, only to be met with closed doors. She even tried to call her parents, but they refused to get involved, saying they didn't want to be dragged into whatever mess you've made for yourself. With each rejection, I could see her spirit breaking a little more. Then, just as I'd expected, she turned to me. One evening, after another day of failed attempts to pick up the pieces, she cornered me in the kitchen. She looked gaunt, shadows under her eyes, hair unkempt. There was none of the poise, the elegance she'd once flaunted so effortlessly, just a broken shell of the woman I used to know. "Brian," she whispered, voice shaking, "please, I need your help." I glanced up from the newspaper I was reading, deliberately taking my time before meeting her gaze. "What exactly do you need my help with, Ashley?" Her lips quivered. I, I've lost everything. The money, the job, Jacob, he's gone. "Please, just help me get back on my feet. I'm begging you." The satisfaction was almost overwhelming. Seeing her, the woman who'd once sneered at my supposed inadequacy, now reduced to begging, it was the culmination of everything I'd worked for. But I wasn't about to let her off that easily. "Go ask your rich boyfriend," I said, voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, wait, you can't, can you? Because he's realized you're not worth the trouble." She recoiled as if slapped, tears welling up. "Please, I'll do anything. Just give me a chance." "Anything," I echoed, standing slowly. I took a step forward, watching her shrink back. "You ruined our life, Ashley. You thought you could leave me and take everything. You thought I'd be too weak to fight back. Now you're the one standing there with nothing. How does it feel?" Her breath hitched, and she crumpled to the floor, sobs racking her body. For a moment, I stood over her, the power dynamic completely reversed. But even as I stared down at her, a hollow emptiness crept into my chest. This victory, everything I'd done to break her, should have felt sweeter. But the satisfaction I'd craved was elusive, slipping through my fingers like sand. I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. "I'm done, Ashley. You want help? Find it somewhere else." That night, she packed her things and left. I didn't stop her. Didn't even look up as she dragged her suitcase out the door. But as soon as it clicked shut behind her, I felt something twist painfully inside me. The house was silent, empty. And despite everything, despite the victory I'd spent months planning and executing, I felt nothing but a deep, consuming sense of loss. It was over. I'd destroyed her. But in doing so, I'd lost something too, something I couldn't quite put into words. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone colder and darker. The realization lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Weeks passed. I heard bits and pieces about Ashley through mutual contacts. She was struggling, financially, emotionally, living in a small, rundown apartment on the other side of town. She'd tried to get another job but found every door closed. Her reputation was shattered, her connections severed. She was completely alone. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice crackled through the line. "Brian, I know you have no reason to listen, but please, I need help." I froze, the sound of her voice dragging up memories I thought I'd buried. She sounded weak, fragile, desperate. "Ashley," I said quietly, "you have some nerve calling me after everything." I know," she pleaded. "But I have nothing left. Please, just give me a chance. I'll pay you back." I'll do whatever you want. I just, I can't keep living like this. For a moment, I almost considered it. Almost. But then the memories of her betrayal, the lies, the sneering arrogance, all of it came rushing back. I tightened my grip on the phone, voice hardening. You think I'd help you now? After you tried to take everything from me? No, Ashley, you got exactly what you deserved. I hung up, cutting off whatever reply she might have had. But even as I set the phone down, I felt that emptiness return, deeper and colder than before. Had I won? Or had I just sunk to her level, dragging myself down into the same pit she'd pulled me into? There were no answers, only silence. Days later, I heard the final piece of news. Jacob had moved on, found some younger, fresher replacement. Ashley, left with nowhere else to turn, had tried to beg her way back into his life. But he'd rejected her, throwing her out like yesterday's trash. She was completely and utterly destroyed. And yet, as I sat there, alone in the house we'd once shared, I realized something chilling. So was I. The thrill of revenge had faded, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell. And now there was only one question left to ask myself. Was it worth it? I wasn't sure anymore. When Ashley called again, I almost didn't pick up. But something in me, curiosity maybe, compelled me to answer. Her voice was different this time, quieter, more resigned. There was no pretense of anger or indignation, no attempt to twist the knife. Just a raw, weary plea. Brian, I know you don't owe me anything, but I need to see you. One last time. I hesitated, fingers tightening around the phone. Why? The word came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't apologize. She had no right to ask for my kindness. Because, she paused, struggling for words. I just need to explain. Please, there's a coffee shop downtown, the one where we used to go, remember? Can you meet me there? The cafe where we first met, the irony wasn't lost on me. I almost laughed, but instead I found myself nodding, even though she couldn't see me. Fine, I said slowly. But don't think for a second that this changes anything. I know, she whispered. Thank you. The line went dead and I stared at the phone, wondering why I had agreed, what was left to say. Maybe I wanted to see how far she'd fallen. Maybe I needed to hear her beg again, to watch her struggle under the weight of her own mistakes. Or maybe, just maybe, I wanted some closure too. Either way, it was time to end this once and for all. The next evening, I arrived at the cafe early. It was quiet, almost deserted. A few lone patrons sat scattered around, engrossed in their own worlds. The familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with a faint hint of vanilla. I chose a corner table, one with a view of the entrance, and ordered a black coffee. No cream, no sugar. Just bitter, like the thoughts swirling through my mind. I didn't have to wait long. Ashley walked in a few minutes later, her frame small and frail beneath an oversized coat. She glanced around, eyes skimming the room before they landed on me. For a moment, she just stood there, as if gathering the courage to come closer. Then slowly she crossed the room and took the seat opposite me. We sat in silence, the air between us thick and charged. She looked terrible. The vibrant, confident woman I once knew was gone, replaced by someone hollow, broken. Her hair hung limp around her face and her eyes were dull, rimmed with dark circles. I took a sip of my coffee, waiting for her to speak. Thank you for meeting me, she began quietly, voice trembling slightly. I know you don't want to be here, and I don't deserve your time, but just get to the point, Ashley. I cut in, tired of the drawn-out theatrics. She flinched but nodded. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Brian, for everything. I know I ruined us. I made so many mistakes, and Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath, visibly fighting for composure. I can't undo any of it, but I need you to know that I never stopped caring about you. Caring, I repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. Is that what you call lying to my face and running off with some rich asshole? Her gaze dropped to the table, fingers twisting together nervously. No, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything, but I've lost everything, Brian, everything, and it's my fault. But I'm trying to pick up the pieces now, trying to save it, I snapped, leaning forward. I didn't come here to hear your sob story. You wanted to see me, so talk. Why am I really here? She swallowed, throat bobbing painfully. I'm leaving, she murmured, for good. I've accepted that there's nothing left for me here. No one wants to hire me, and I don't have a place to stay. I can't even look at myself in the mirror anymore. So I'm going out of state. I wanted to tell you in person because I needed you to know that I'm not going to fight you anymore. I'm withdrawing the divorce claim. For a moment, I could only stare at her, stunned. She was giving up after everything she'd tried to take from me. You're serious? I asked, cautiously narrowing my eyes. She nodded slowly. Yes, I'm not going to drag you through court or try to take anything. I don't have the energy and I don't have the right. I'll sign whatever papers you need me to sign. I leaned back, processing her words. This was it. The end of the war I'd started. The victory I'd fought so hard for. And yet, staring at her now, I felt no triumph, just a hollow sort of relief. Why now? I demanded, needing to understand. Why not months ago? Why put us both through hell? Because I was scared, she whispered, voice breaking. Scared of being alone, scared of losing everything. But now that I realize what I did to you, to us. And I couldn't bear it anymore. I glanced away, the weight of her words pressing down on me. There it was, regret, true and unvarnished. But it came too late, far too late. So you're just running away? I said bitterly. That's your solution? Maybe it's cowardly, she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. But it's the only way I can let go. I'm done fighting, Brian. I'm done trying to pretend I have any control left. I studied her, searching for some hint of deception. But all I saw was the broken shell of a woman who'd once torn my life apart. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. The hatred I'd nursed for so long, the burning desire for revenge. It flickered, then dimmed, leaving only ashes behind. What about your debts? I asked flatly. What are you going to do? Her shoulders slumped. I don't know, she whispered. I'll figure it out. But it's not your problem anymore. I stared at her, feeling the last remnants of my anger fade away. There was no satisfaction in seeing her like this, no twisted pleasure, just emptiness. She was already ruined. Anything more would just be cruelty for the sake of it. And hadn't I sunk low enough? I let out a long breath, leaning back in my chair. I'll settle your debts, Ashley, but don't mistake this for forgiveness or pity. I'm only doing it to make sure you don't try to drag me down with you later. Her head snapped up, eyes wide with disbelief. You would do that? Yes, I said coldly. But after that, we're done. I don't want to hear from you again. Ever. She nodded quickly, tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you. I don't know what to say. There's nothing left to say. I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. This is goodbye, Ashley. Whatever happens next, don't come looking for me. I turned to leave, but she called out softly, Brian, I'm so sorry. I paused, my back to her, then nodded once without turning around. I know. I walked out of the cafe, feeling a strange lightness settle over me. It wasn't peace, not quite. But it was something close. I'd come full circle, from betrayal to revenge to, release. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to truly let go, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The streets outside were quiet, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows. As I stood there watching the world continue to move on, I realized that this was the closure I'd been seeking. Not the destruction of Ashley's life, but the knowledge that I could finally walk away. I didn't need to hate her anymore. I didn't need to be consumed by the past. It was over. And I was free. With a deep breath, I turned and started walking, leaving the cafe and everything it represented behind. For good this time. There was no going back, only forward. The days after Ashley's departure felt surreal. The house, once a battlefield of whispered arguments and resentful silence, now echoed with an emptiness that was almost tangible. I wandered through the rooms aimlessly, pausing occasionally at places that were steeped in old memories. A framed photograph on the mantel, her perfume lingering faintly in the bedroom. Each reminder carried a bittersweet sting, but I forced myself not to look away. This was part of the process, I told myself, confronting the past, even when it hurt. I thought I'd feel triumphant, relieved at the very least. But what settled inside me instead was a strange, muted hollowness. Yes, I'd won. I'd gotten what I wanted. Her groveling, her admission of guilt, and her complete submission to my terms. I'd wiped out her safety net, torn down the life she'd tried to build without me, and walked away without so much as a backward glance. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was an odd sort of fatigue. I threw myself back into work, hoping that burying my mind in spreadsheets and strategy meetings would distract me. My colleagues seemed surprised to see me so frequently at the office, often late into the night. Maybe they sensed the change in me, the dogged focus that bordered on obsession. They offered tentative nods of sympathies, their smiles touched with pity. I brushed them off, staying resolutely professional, refusing to give them a glimpse of what was truly churning inside. It wasn't just about escaping memories of Ashley. It was about reclaiming something I'd lost during those months of bitterness and revenge, a sense of self. The Brian I used to be, before suspicions and betrayal consumed me, had been driven, successful, respected. I needed to find that man again, rebuild him from the fragments that remained. I started by reclaiming my social life, reconnecting with old friends I'd neglected. Dinners, casual outings, even weekend trips. Slowly, I pieced together a semblance of normalcy. It wasn't easy. Conversations felt stilted at first, and I struggled to find enjoyment in things I used to love. But I pushed myself through it, determined not to let the past define me. One evening, I found myself sitting across from Michael, an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. We were at a quiet bar downtown, a place we used to frequent back in our younger days. He looked at me over his drink, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You seem different, Brian," he said bluntly. "More intense, I guess. What's going on?" I hesitated, swirling the whiskey in my glass. How could I explain it? The journey I'd been on, the things I'd done, but Michael had always been direct, and I owed him the same. "Went through a rough patch," I said carefully. "Marriage ended badly. Made some decisions I'm still processing." "Badly, huh?" He leaned back, studying me with a perceptive gaze. "What kind of bad? Because you look like you've been through a goddamn war." I huffed a short laugh, the sound devoid of humor. "Feels like it sometimes. But it's over now." "Is it?" He pressed gently. "You've moved on." I paused, considering the question. Had I? I'd cut Ashley out of my life, severed every tie, every lingering thread that bound us together. But moving on was more than just physical separation. It was mental, emotional. It was letting go of the anger, the need for vindication. It was finding a way to forgive, not her, but myself, for getting lost in the darkness. "I'm trying to," I admitted finally, surprising myself with the honesty. "It's a work in progress." Michael nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. Just don't let it eat you up, man. Some people aren't worth the damage they leave behind." He had no idea how close to the truth he was, but his words struck a chord. I'd spent so long consumed by Ashley's betrayal that I'd allowed it to warp me, to pull me into a place I never wanted to go. Now it was time to reclaim the pieces I'd lost. In the following weeks, I shifted my focus. Instead of running from what I'd done, I began confronting it head on. I sought out a therapist, something I'd never considered before all this. It felt strange at first, sitting in that quiet office, talking to a stranger about the darkest parts of my life. But gradually, session by session, I started to untangle the mess of emotions that had coiled tight around me. I talked about the anger, the betrayal, and the satisfaction I'd felt in tearing Ashley's world apart. I talked about how that satisfaction had turned to ash, how I'd been left with nothing but emptiness. And slowly I began to understand the root of it all, not just the pain of being cheated on, but the deeper sense of inadequacy it had awakened in me. My need for revenge hadn't been about justice. It had been about proving something to myself, proving I wasn't weak, proving I could take back control. Revenge is a seductive thing, my therapist said one afternoon, her voice calm and steady. It promises satisfaction, but it often leaves us emptier than before. You need to ask yourself, was the cost worth it? I didn't answer immediately. I wasn't sure I could. Because the truth was, I still didn't know, but at least now I was willing to explore the question. As the months passed, I started to rebuild, not just my life, but my identity. I invested more time in things that mattered to me, my career, my friendships, my own sense of fulfillment. I took up running again, letting the physical exertion clear my mind. I started reading more, reconnecting with hobbies I'd abandoned. It was a slow, often frustrating process, but each small step felt like a victory. One day, as I sat alone in my living room, now devoid of any trace of Ashley, I realized that the pain had lessened. It was still there like a scar, but it no longer dominated my every thought. I could think of her without that immediate surge of anger or regret. I could think of what I'd done and, while not forgive myself entirely, at least accept it as part of my journey. I wasn't proud of everything I'd done, but I was learning to live with it. Then came the final step, letting go of the house. It was filled with too many ghosts, too many memories. Selling it felt like shedding the last remnant of a life that no longer fit. I moved into a new place, smaller, more modern, with no history attached to it. The first night I spent there, I sat on the balcony, looking out at the city lights, feeling lighter than I had in years. As I gazed at the skyline, I thought back to the man I used to be, the man I'd become, and the man I wanted to be moving forward. It wasn't about being strong or dominant. It was about being whole again. I'd lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but now I could see a path ahead. A path that was mine alone. Michael called me a few days later, inviting me to a casual get-together. I hesitated, then accepted. As I walked into the bar that evening, I felt a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation. Would it be awkward? Would they see through the facade I'd carefully built? But the night turned out better than expected. We laughed, shared stories, reconnected. And for the first time in a long while, I found myself genuinely enjoying the company. I wasn't hiding behind bitterness or resentment. I was just Brian, just me. Toward the end of the night, Michael pulled me aside, his expression serious. "You look good, man." "Ah, he said, "like you finally found your footing." I smiled, the weight in my chest easing slightly. "Yeah, I think I have." We clinked glasses, and as I looked around at the people who'd stood by me, who'd welcomed me back without judgment or pity, I felt a surge of gratitude. I wasn't alone. I wasn't lost. I was healing. Walking home that night, the crisp air brushing against my face, I realized that this moment of quiet contentment was what I'd been searching for all along. Not revenge, not retribution, just a chance to start over. I'd been through hell, and I had the scars to prove it, but I was still standing, still moving forward, and that was enough. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. I brewed a cup of coffee, stood by the window, and watched the world wake up. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. I was free, free from the shadows of betrayal, free from the chains of revenge, free to live life on my own terms. Whatever came next, I was ready.